person, and almost 2 years since we've been able to have people in the theatre. So on behalf of everybody at the Belfry, thank you for your patience and your support. It's meant the world to all of us. And we're starting the season with a fantastic, relatively new Canadian play called Serving Elizabeth, which premiered in Kamloops just before the pandemic and was produced this past summer at Stratford Festival. And you're going to see a fantastic, beautiful, beautiful, and very moving production. And this morning you'll meet the director of that production and one of the stars, as well as two very informative members of the Victoria community. So we started B4Play 9 years ago, and it's become a core part of our activities here at the Belfry. And it was designed, as you know, to provide you with insights into the upcoming production and some context around the themes and issues that are addressed in the play. And since the very beginning, B4Play has been a collaboration, a very happy collaboration between the Belfry Theatre and CBC Radio. The CBC rebroadcasts these interviews throughout the run of the show, which is fantastic. And throughout all that time, the remarkable Gregor Craigie has been our host for these every one of these B4Plays. So thank you. You all know Gregor as the host of CBC Radio's On the Island, and I hope you will also get to know him as the author of On Borrowed Time, a fantastic book about earthquakes. But I just said to Gregor, reading it actually, it was great. It's great to have information about it. It actually made me less just kind of existentially frightened, and to have information and to understand the whole issue. So get a copy. And Gregor just informed me that he's been nominated for a Writers' Trust Award for. So I'll remind you to please turn your cell phones off because these interviews are going to be rebroadcast. I'd also just like to point out, you may know if you've bought tickets for Serving Elizabeth, we won't be handing out programs just for safety's sake, but all the information that would normally be in the program is on our website, as well as a digital edition of Upstage magazine, which we're also not publishing in hard copies yet. So it's worth checking that out. And I wanted to introduce Maddie Cervantes, who is the Belfry's manager of community and artistic connections, and Maddie is the curator for B4Play. So we have Maddie to thank for a wonderful book. That's everything. I just want to mention that I've told Nigel and Lucinda, because today's a very busy day in the theatre, that if they want to slip out after their interviews, they're so without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to once again hand the hosting duties over to Gregor Craigie.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for coming. I should just let our at-home audience know we are all masked and socially distanced. It's so nice to see people, even with the masks on your faces. So nice to see so many familiar faces and new faces, and aren't we lucky to be back here at the Belfry Theatre. I don't know about you, but some of the things that I've missed over the last year and a half have just reminded me and maybe given me a new appreciation for how much they matter to us. And I count the Belfry and live theatre almost at the top of the list, so it's really nice to be back here. But let's find out about Serving Elizabeth. I promise not to ask any questions about earthquakes. I'm not going to presuppose what any answers will be, but no questions about earthquakes. Our first guest is the director. Nigel Sean Williams is the former co-artistic director of Factory Theatre. His theatre career spans more than 25 years as an artist and includes a number of Canadian premieres. Nigel is active in new play development, having helped to develop more than 40 new plays, either as an actor, director, or dramaturge. He's also an educator, having taught at York University, the University of Windsor, and the National Theatre School. Please welcome to B4Play, Nigel Sean Williams.
Good morning.
Morning. It's good to have you with us. Thanks for doing this, because I know it's a busy weekend.
Oh, absolutely. But I just got to say, it's so great to be in person with people. I think I've missed theatre so much, and when we had, this is not a question, I'm taking over right now. All of a sudden. Go. But I remember on our first day of rehearsal how emotional it was for the entire company, like the actors and the staff here, because I think we'd taken it for granted. We'd forgotten how much we miss theatre and how much we miss like that human interaction. So it's just lovely to be here with you.
It must be, I mean, actors and theatre professionals have arguably been challenged more than most of us. I mean, I've been privileged to go into the radio studio and people have to be over the phone, but to have the stage taken away from you, it must have been so unsettling, to put it mildly.
It was, but there's also I think a larger like heartbreak with, if you think about the national artists and the national arts community, because most artists are independent contractors, we're self-employed, and so there's no like social support, there's no EI for us, and so I think that as soon as the pandemic like hit us and the theaters that shut down, like our livelihoods went away, but also the arts was one of the last industries to be allowed, back into motion. So, it was very difficult. I know a lot of colleagues who were forced out of the business, the industry, and had to like find other employment. So, but we're back.
You're back.
And
exactly.
There's hope.
That's right.
And optimism.
And we'll look forward. But just before we do, I wonder if you can take us way back, before the pandemic.
Like when I was a child? Or?
Well, I'll let you decide. When did you first think, I think I want to make a livelihood, I want to devote my life to the theatre?
Oh, well, against my parents' wishes, really. It's in a lot of ways, it was one of those stories that you hear often. I had a fantastic high school theatre teacher. His name, the late Frank Luke, and I think I was just engaged in a way that I'd never been in high school. There was like a freedom and a courageousness being in the theater class, and it was very much away from like the hoodlums and the kids that I was hanging out with, and I just had this. Something just turned on in my brain about what was available and what was like what an opportunity it could be to be a storyteller and to be courageous and have fun, but at the same time risk. And yeah, my parents wanted me to be an eye doctor, but so that heart was broken. But I think that's also somewhat related to the theater. Like my parents, I'm Jamaican. I was born in Jamaica, and we came here in the late '60s. And I think that every parent wants the best for their child, and we have this this sense of Jamaica being was a colony. Of the British Empire, there was this sense of structure and want and what you're supposed to want and what you're supposed to be, and I think that my parents were, and a lot of us we're stuck in that, and inevitably they allowed me to take the risk to be an artist, and once they understood that it was connected to my happiness, it's been a very lovely road, and my parents are very supportive right now.
And what about two of the main tracks, being a director and being an actor? They must have some complementary aspects, but they must also have some really different skill sets or challenges. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say, and I can only speak from my experience. I don't want to I'm not going to speak on this as a voice of all directors and actors, but at the core of it, there's a sense of courageousness and insanity that I think that, like, just being in the theater but being a director and being an actor, there is a love for storytelling and having an opportunity and a responsibility to create our stories for this country and or to tell other stories and infuse it with the optics of this country. And for me, it's to always give voice to my optic as being like a black artist and you know, when someone like in my generation, being like a father and being a husband. So there's always something personal in the responsibility of telling a story for me, and I think that is one of the I guess the common ground of being a director and being an actor is that there's a love for storytelling, and there's a love for danger. I never want to be the smartest person in the room as a director, and so having an opportunity to be a collaborator and to allow so many other artists to have a voice is really important to me. But yeah, at the core of it, it's being a storyteller and having a little sense of madness in you.
And what can you tell us about this story that you're telling? And I know you don't want to give away any spoilers. And can you give us a sense of what impelled playwright Marcia Johnson to write it?
Well, from my understanding, Marcia Johnson wrote this play as a reaction to watching season 1, episode 2 of The Crown, and that episode takes place in Kenya. In Niali, Kenya, when Princess Elizabeth was touring, and she was in Kenya when she found out that her father George VI had passed away. That episode of The Crown had no significant roles for blacks. They were in Kenya. They spent a great amount of time in that setting and in the script, but all the blacks were muted. They were silent, and I believe that as a reaction to that, as a voice, Marcia wanted to write this play, and this play does investigate representation and inclusion and I suppose the repercussions of all of us. I guess it's the repercussions of colonialism and the active policy of imperialism, and how that affects us all, even if we're not aware of it. Then there are microaggressions against like race and gender that ultimately started centuries ago through the act of imperialism. So I think that's what Marcia wanted to investigate, and that's what the play is investigating. And the way that I look at it, the play happens on the cusp of 3 revolutions. And the first revolution in 1952 is the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. The second one is just before the announcement of Brexit. And the third revolution is one of the main characters, this young black woman who finds her voice, who finds herself and her independence through all of this and through all the noise. And so that's the story that I'm trying to tell.
Well, I wonder how you related to this, both as a person and a director, as a person with decades experience as a black theater professional, and as someone with a Jamaican family and Jamaican heritage, given the colonial context. How did this resonate with you personally, and how did that influence your directing and engagement with the script?
I think I'm very fortunate right now in my career that I can say no to things, and I find myself only being interested in projects that align with my social politics. I find that I'm at this point in my life, my career, that I would rather live without regret, and so it would be regretful for me to not be active in the conversation of representation and inclusion and then all the social and political conversations that are happening now. Like my art is my activism, always. And so the context in which we want to see the play and imbue the play is very much in line with what is important to me. So it's also absolutely having an understanding of what colonialism has done to countries like Jamaica or Kenya, but also Canada, and we hang on to old guards for good or ill. Don't get me wrong. There's lovely things. I'm not an anti-monarchist at all, but I think that we should be looking at things in a completely different way. And sometimes we're stuck in history, but not understanding history at the same time. But to get back to, that was a long-winded way to answer your question. But I'm connected to it personally, and I can only tell stories honestly if I connect to it personally and honestly.
Yeah, it didn't seem long-winded to me because it's a big question. I mean, it's a huge question.
Yeah, but you didn't start that way. You didn't start. This is a big question, Nigel.
but it is so important. And again, we face this week, and the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement seem to have had a significant impact on all aspects of society, including the arts. How, in your view, has it changed the conversation? Has it changed what you do, being an activist through art, or has it? I wonder, what are your reflections on the last few years in that sense?
So that's a large question.
That's a large question, yeah.
There's many folds to that. I'm still very saddened that it took the death of a young black man to finally awaken conversations that should have started about 100 years ago. I'm always an optimist, but I think that I'm much more cautious now about my optimism, because I need to find out what is the difference between gestures and permanent policy. So time will tell whether or not there has been any significant change. I think that there has been immediate significant change, because I can see it with the casting in film and television. There's much more actors, artists of color that are a bit more in the forefront, and that's fantastic. But that's also something that should have happened years and years and years ago. It's too soon to tell. I think that there's a danger of making blanket statements about change until we understand what is a long-term commitment of not just organizations, single organizations, but a collective ideology, like a national ideology change or ideological change. So I know I'm not really answering your question, but I think I can't really speak on that just yet. Like I was incredibly optimistic as a younger man, and I find myself that over the last 2 or 3 years, my optimism has become cautious, and that bothers me. Because the conversations that we're all having, which are healthy conversations, it angers me sometimes that we're just having these conversations. Sorry.
I appreciate what you said, that it may be too soon. So in a way, it's an unfair question. I mean, when you mentioned your father, when you think of your own kids, I mean, I wonder what are your hopes for the progress we will make? And that's a huge question. So take from it what you will. But I'm curious for your thoughts.
No, it's great to go first at 11 o'clock in the morning and dive into these things on just one cup of coffee. Just like I was saying before, if I can do what I love and do what I love passionately, I hope my kids see that and see that freedom. The work that I do and the work that I choose to do, it speaks directly to a hope of clarity for their path to live freely. Like my kids are mixed race, so that complicates their lives even more, and so does it complicate their own individual identity of whether or not I'm black or white. That conversation at home is often and very delicate depending upon their age. But I just like any other parent would like to be active in creating a world or a society in which they can freely walk through this world without looking over their shoulder or without fear. And it seems that the work that I do may not be incredibly important, but I think, and I don't think it's being naive. I think that telling stories and sharing stories has way more power than we believe. I think that the fabric of our country hinges upon the stories that we tell and the continuation of sharing stories. So if nothing else, I hope that what I do has some sort of small significance to my kids and others, just as far as sharing a story and having community. Like this in and of itself, we're sharing community right now. Whether or not we know each other, we're in the same time and space, and this can't be replaced. It's different than, unfortunately, the energy and the immediacy of our friends and colleagues who are streaming this. There's always a different dynamic, and I think that theater, the power of theater is next to none for me.
And so when people return to those seats in the theater there and watch this story, what do you hope audiences take away from it?
That's a really interesting question. Because I just try to tell the story as honestly as possible, and I'm not necessarily sure whether or not I have any responsibility to how a listener or receiver gets that story. Yeah. We're also different, and so we're going to we're going to see ourselves in so many of the characters, and any good story, any good piece of theater is filled with contradictions, and inside those contradictions is where we find ourselves as human beings. And so as much as the positive aspects that happen in this play, there are negative aspects that happen in this play, and if the audiences actually can relate to both polars, then that's kind of a step forward as being an individual human.
Nigel, it's great to meet you, and I really appreciate you doing this. Thank you very much. And one thought.
Oh yeah. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. Thank you. Now, Michael said before, and I'm so sorry. I would love to stay, but I got a show to put together, so unfortunately I can't stay. But thank you so much, and thank you. Okay.
Take care. Nigel Sean Williams is the former co-artistic director of Factory Theatre and is the director of Serving Elizabeth at the Belfry Theatre. Our next guest is also on a time crunch, so we completely understand if she needs to leave after the fact as well. Lucinda Davis is a Montreal-based actor and is making her Belfry debut with Serving Elizabeth. She's a co-founder of Metachroma Theatre, whose mandate is to normalize the presence of diverse performers on Canadian stages. She received her performance, or for her performance in Harlem Duet, she won the Montreal English Theatre Award for Best Actress. She's also won the Prix Rideau Award, the ACTRA Montreal Awards for voice performance, and was ACTRA Montreal's Woman of the Year in 2017. Please welcome to Belfry B4Play, Lucinda Davis.
Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us on a Saturday. It is Saturday, right? I lose track of times now.
Thanks for joining us, because we know you're busy. So again, if you need to rush off, that's completely understood.
Thank you.
Before we talk about serving Elizabeth, can you tell us a bit about your own background in acting? I understand you had what some might call an unusual start. Is that fair to say?
Okay, it's a bit of a long story, so I apologize. So I, in university, used to do background work. You know, so whenever you're watching a film or a TV program, there's people in the background just walking by or having drinks in a restaurant, not saying anything. So that was my job when I was in university. And the casting house that usually gives me these engagements called and said, we have a series lead audition for you. And I thought they made a mistake, you know, because I had absolutely no ambitions to be an actor. I wanted to be an actor so desperately, but I had no confidence in myself, and I definitely didn't have parental approval. So I was going to be a psychologist. So I went to the casting house thinking they're going to see me and say, oh no, we've made a mistake, so sorry. And no, they gave me a script for me to read. I still didn't understand how I had this audition. I auditioned. The director called me at home in the next few days and was trying to give me tips for my callback. And I said, how did you call? Like, I don't understand how I got this audition. And she said, the role that I was auditioning for was kind of like the class dits. And so she received 3 piles of photos. Pile A were the best actors in Montreal. Pile B, well, if you don't like anyone in pile A, you'll definitely find someone in pile B. And pile C, well, you look at them if you have the time. And my photo was in pile C. But every single submission was a blonde woman. My photo stood out just a little bit, just a tad. So this director didn't understand why only blonde women were being suggested, so just was kind of like rifling through the photos, and obviously my photo popped out and said, yes, give her an audition, simply because she didn't understand why everyone who was submitted was blonde, and I got the part. So I didn't have an agent, so the director made me contact her agent, and then I had to get professional photos. So I got my start in acting in reverse, where I booked the TV show, then got an agent, then had my photos done.
And did the confidence come with that? Because you talked about that, how you'd kind of, you just didn't think it was even going to happen.
No.
So what was it like once you started? Did the confidence come, or how did you grow into that role?
Well, I mean, it was such a great TV show. We were just a bunch of 20-year-olds just having fun. It was a really funny show on YTV. And I think forming that family and that bond with everybody, and I'm just so happy telling the story every day that I just knew this is what I wanted to do forever. And so found the strength to say, sorry, Mom, psychology is not my dream, and pursue what I've always wanted to do since I was little.
And I understand Serving Elizabeth deals partly with a television production company. And because you've worked in TV and theater and film, can you give us a sense of some of the differences in processes and the different skills required between the three?
Sure. So the beauty of theater is, you walk in the first day and you get to meet everybody. You get to meet the staff of the Belfry, you get to meet those who will be backstage, you get to meet the designers. Everyone gets together and they meet. And there's this understanding they're all embarking on this story together. Whereas in film and TV, you just get to work on bits. So you have your script, maybe you'll get the whole script, maybe you won't. And you're just gonna come in and you're just gonna do your bit, and then you're gonna go home. And you're never gonna think about that bit again. Whereas with theater, a story gets to grow. You get to deepen, and I just much prefer theater. Even the director's vision, you get to understand what a full, complete story is in theater, not in film. You won't know what it is until it's finished. And then, of course, there's editing, and there's all sorts of tricks that happen that you have no part of. I would also say the difference would be focus. When you're doing film and TV, the camera's right here. So everything is very subtle. You can do little things, and you can communicate that same story. Whereas in theater, you're much further away from me than this person in the front row, but you both have to hear the same story. So I have to make sure that I'm broadcasting the story directly to you, no matter where the person is sitting, so that everyone's receiving the same story. Whereas with film and TV, it's edited so that the people know exactly what they're supposed to be looking at. So I think the focus and the specificity of theater and the full storytelling is what I prefer.
What a difference. I mean, the way you explain that. So at the end, when you take your bow at the end on stage, you know what the audience has experienced.
Yes.
You've been part of it. What was it like waiting to see a final edited version of a TV or film piece? I mean, that must be agony.
I'll admit I don't often watch the things I've been filmed in,
Yeah.
very, very often. I mean, the just performing on stage, the audience is also part of that show. You know, every audience is different. Sometimes you have shyer audiences, sometimes you have audiences that are very boisterous, and that does absolutely affect the storytelling in a good way, you know. But with a film, you don't know how that story is going to reach the people until you get reviews later on. So there's just something, you know, we're invited to participate in a social experiment together in theater, and it's a bit more removed in film and TV. But it's still, again, wonderful storytelling as well, but my preference is in theater.
And in theater, in Serving Elizabeth, you portrayed two roles, Mercy and Patricia. What can you tell us about Mercy, first of all, and her attitude towards the monarchy in particular?
Oh boy. So yes, Mercy's story takes place in 1552 in Kenya, just before Princess Elizabeth's arrival. She owns a restaurant, runs and cooks in a restaurant, is fiercely devoted to her family, protective of her daughter, and her husband, who has suffered a stroke and is at home and can't participate in the daily upkeep of the family. And because of what she's endured under imperialism, British imperialism in Kenya, she's very wary and untrusting of white British settlers. And so her story of wanting to protect her child and protect her husband and make sure that everyone is okay, and then suddenly, you know, without giving too much away, a British envoy arrives with an offer to have her cook for the princess, and what that means, because she needs the money, but also she doesn't trust what they are going to do to her family, what possible uprooting she will have to endure in order to protect her family again.
And what about Patricia? I mean, what's it like to play two different characters? And I wonder how, without giving too much away, how they interact.
Oh,
For you.
I mean, I love, you know, as an actor, you want to play all the roles, so as many roles as possible, you know. I mean, it's great because, you know, Mercy is so strong and independent and very guarded. And then I have an opportunity to be a bit more funny and casual and lighter with Patricia, so that I'm not carrying this heavy, I'm very wary of British people, and then I get to be like, hello, you know. So Patricia, oh, hi. Patricia is a casting agent for this British TV show, and so she's trying to find, you know, match all the perfect elements for the television show. So she's very friendly, she's very warm and bubbly, which is a direct contrast, who's trying to protect her family.
Is it difficult to go back and forth between the two if they're contrasting like that?
Well, you know, you get help. You're aided by a costume. Like, you know, when you're rehearsing in the rehearsal hall, and you just have the script and you're playing both characters, it tends to be very voice directed. You know, I try to think about how my body's placed for the different characters, but then as soon as you have the costume, the character really comes alive. Really, something really happens as soon as you have all the pieces and you're looking at yourself like, yeah, this is Mercy, and yeah, this is Patricia. So. But yes, it's a thrill for me to have as many different aspects of the story to tell.
I wonder if you get asked for advice much from young BIPOC artists, and in terms of beginning their journey as an actor. What would you tell a young actor who came to you starting out?
One, to learn the power of no. So often, especially when you're training in theater, you are told, yes, yes, be open, be receptive, be accepting, to not just block everything. And I feel that can lead you to be taken advantage of down the road. You also feel like you want to say yes to every single project, and maybe not every project is best for you. And so the power of no would be a very important lesson, I feel, for any artist. There will be those gigs that will fill your belly, and those that will fulfill your soul. And sometimes those projects exist in one. But no matter which role that you take, to make sure that it is a story that you love. It's a story that you're going to enjoy telling every day. And to not be afraid to say no to a story that you don't think that you'll enjoy telling, because we love to share stories. And so to make sure that whatever role that you have, and no matter how your skin, your body is to be represented, that it is still a story that you are going to love carrying, and that you will, as Nigel said earlier, be able to live with.
Okay, so you said yes to serving Elizabeth.
Oh, yes.
And you want to love the play. So what do you love about serving Elizabeth?
What I love, I mean, I also had a visceral reaction when I saw episode 2 of The Crown. So when my agent offered me, said that they're interested in seeing me for this role, and I read the script, it just spoke to me. That's exactly how I felt, in terms of a missing voice, a missing perspective, blatantly missing perspective in this episode. So I loved that, especially during the pandemic, with the world paying more attention to what is happening in regards to systemic racism, that I believe a story like this was very apt and necessary and timely, now that there's more eyes willing to pay attention and more ears open to, oh, I didn't realize this perspective. And so it's just come at a perfect time, with everybody, trapped in their homes, trapped on their devices, trying to access world in this technological landscape, to now have a story to reach minds that are more open to hearing other perspectives.
Lucinda, it's great of you to join us. Thanks for taking the time on this busy
Thank
weekend.
you so much for coming. I will be escaping.
Lucinda Davis is starring as both Mercy and Patricia in Serving Elizabeth. Our next guest is Dr. Marielle Grant Robson, an associate professor of history at the University of Victoria. She holds an honors degree in history from Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario, and a doctorate in history from the University of Oxford, and joins us at B4Play to talk about the historical context of the play. Please welcome Dr. Robson. Well done. Good morning.
Good morning.
The microphone's a bit, you can put it wherever you like. That's perfect.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us. Where did your interest in history come from? And can you give us a brief background of your academic journey here?
Well, interestingly enough, given the topic we're covering, I got interested in history when I was a young girl, and my mother introduced me to a BBC television series about the history of the royal family, which was called The Six Wives of Henry VIII. And I got fascinated by the story, and I went to the library because I wanted to find out, whether this was true, whether this actually happened. And then when I went to university, I kind of got caught by the history bug, because one of my professors pointed out to me that historians get to study everything. Everything is grist to our mill. And we're storytellers, which is why it's fascinating to talk about theater, because that's what historians do too. Mm-hmm. We teach people about the past, and we're telling people a story, and it's not about dates, it's about why things happened and why it's important that they happened. And then I was very fortunate, I won actually a Commonwealth scholarship to go to England to study, and then luckily for me there was a job in Victoria.
And so what is your primary focus of history?
The history of the modern mass media, the history of public relations and propaganda in the era of the two world wars, and I've also done some work on the history of the monarchy.
Now, I wonder if you can give us a picture of the historical context in which this play takes place in colonial Africa and the British Crown.
Yeah, it's a dual time play. So it takes place in England in 2015 around the production of a television program, which is The Crown. Yes. And it takes place in Kenya in 1952, when Kenya was a British colony. And Princess Elizabeth was there on a tour because her father was too ill. And she and her husband were only in Kenya for 5 days, because when they were there, the news came that her father had died. And in the play, what the author has done, the playwright has done, is created a play within the play so that she has really rewritten the episode of The Crown from 1952 and put Kenyan voices into the story in the person of Mercy and her daughter. And Mercy is serving Elizabeth, and one of the things she, not to give too much away, but she tells Elizabeth, you took our land. And so she brings to the fore the whole colonial history and what has happened to her people, the Kiyukiu, who have basically saw their land expropriated by the British over the course of the first half of the 20th century.
And is, when she talks about that, is she talking about the common British and other colonial practice of taking over land and taking over all control over the land they're in, or something else?
Well, she's talking basically about the expropriation of the land, but she's also talking about the destruction of the way of life of her people. Because when the white settlers came, the first white settlers came in 1902, but it was really after the Great War that there was a real incursion, and the white settlers put an enormous amount of pressure on the British government to let them bring in policies which essentially made it impossible for native farmers to live off the land. And the Kiyukiu people, of whom Mercy is a member, made up 20% of the population, and they were hardest hit by the land grab. And that's why, as early as the 1920s, they were actively organizing to seek redress of grievances. Mm-hmm. And when the play happens in the early 1950s, there was a very active movement in Kenya, led by Kenyatta, who was trying to secure redress of grievances, and a part of that group broke off essentially and became the Mau Mau. And there were some stirrings of unrest at the time Elizabeth was there, which of course are not covered in the television series The Crown.
Right. Can you talk to us about classicism and how perhaps it's explored in Serving Elizabeth?
Well, I think the interesting thing about this play is that it explores prejudice on a number of different levels, gender, sexual orientation, race. But really, I think one of the major themes comes through in the title, which is Serving Elizabeth. It's about servility. It's about making people be deferential to other people based on certain assumptions about social hierarchy. And in both sets of the play, in both parts, you see characters who are basically chastised for not being deferential, for not staying in their place. And so I think it generally, what comes through in the play is the prevalence of inequality and how insidious that is. And so, you know, at one point, Mercy talks to Princess Elizabeth, and Elizabeth finds her very presumptuous and tells her that. But it's not because Mercy is a black woman, it's because Mercy has gone beyond the bounds of socially acceptable behavior, and she is challenging authority. So I think really through the whole play, it's a metaphor for colonialism and the notion that, you know, there's an authority and everyone else should just kowtow to it. And even in the modern part of the play, when Tia, the young intern, challenges Morris, the playwriter, about how he has depicted Kenya in 1952 in his television series, she is chastised for challenging him, for daring to speak her voice. And I think that's a central part of the play here. It's about people finding their voice and being able to express their voice without repercussions, without being looked down upon. So I think it's a fascinating play in the way it brings together a whole slew of different prejudices. And central to it is this notion of social hierarchy and inequality.
And presumably in 1952, Kenya, a Kenyan finding their voice against the British, or up to the British monarchy, would be a tall task, or would be really speaking out of what the British colonial rulers thought was their place.
Oh, definitely.
Now, did the relationship between Britain and Kenya change during Queen Elizabeth's reign? Because this takes place, the first setting is during the beginning. What happened after that? And how does it perhaps influence getting to the more modern scene?
Well, Elizabeth and Philip were only there for 5 days, and there was no unrest when they were in Kenya. But the Mau Mau uprising began in the late summer of 1952 and went on to 1959. And it was characterized by an enormous amount of brutality on the part of the British authorities. Actually, there are still people seeking reparations. In fact, as late as the last 2 years, there have been still investigations going on in Britain as to what actually happened. But by the end of the 1950s, British governments were starting to accept the idea that decolonization and devolution of empire was probably the best way forward. And Harold Macmillan was in South Africa in 1960, and he made a speech talking about the wind of change blowing through the continent. And so by 1960, the British government in London, much to the chagrin of the white settlers in Kenya, was willing to negotiate with the leaders of the Kenyan African Union. And so Kenyatta, who had been in jail for 6 or 7 years, was released. And in 1963, Kenya was granted independence. Prince Philip went to Kenya to participate in the independence ceremonies. And then a year later, Kenya declared itself to be a republic, but because it was possible to do so, decided to stay in the Commonwealth. And the Queen's been there several times since. She went on a state visit in 1983.
I wondered about that historically on the record. Is there evidence or indication of meaningful relations or interactions between Elizabeth and Kenyan people?
Since the 1970s, yes, I think so. I mean, she definitely has formed relationships with leading African leaders over time. I mean, one of the most famous developments, as you want to put it that way, was when she did in Ghana in 1961 dance publicly with the Ghanaian president, which was seen as very forward thinking on her part. But the other thing, too, is I think what's really important if you look at the history of the monarchy over the course of the 20th century, you see the development of what historians call the welfare monarchy, whereby as the political role of the crown diminished, its social role increased, and that the role of the crown, and the Queen has really, I think, and her family cultivated this, has been to advocate on behalf of marginalized groups, to take up worthy causes. And so when you look at the coverage of the royal tour to Kenya in 1983, there are definitely Black voices. And she is engaging with the ordinary people. So I don't know if I answered your question.
I think you did. I was curious about that, how that evolved over years. And what about today, finally? How does the Commonwealth and Kenya and other African countries interact? How has this evolved? And I mean, this is a big question. And to what extent does it need to still?
Well, you know, the interesting thing about the Commonwealth is that when it was formed in 1926, it was made up of Great Britain and the so-called White Dominions, who viewed themselves as equals aligned in allegiance to the same monarch. But the Commonwealth as an institution has evolved dramatically since that time. In 1949, it was agreed that countries which had been under British colonial rule, which were no longer under British colonial rule and wanted to become republics, could stay in the Commonwealth. They dropped the term British in 1949. And actually, since 1995, any country that wants to can join the Commonwealth, regardless of whether or not it has had any imperial connection with Britain at all. So the most recent member to join was Rwanda in 2009, which has no colonial history with Britain.
Right.
There are 54 nations in the Commonwealth right now. 19 of them are in Africa, including Kenya. And so I think the fact that the Commonwealth continues to exist and the fact that new members are coming in, the most recent members are Mozambique and Rwanda, points to the fact that there are nations in the world that see a value in having access to this kind of organization, which really, in this day and age, is committed to promoting democracy, but also committing to giving smaller nations a voice on the world stage. And I think the interesting thing, too, is if you look at the relationship between the Crown and the Commonwealth, with the Queen Elizabeth as the head of the Commonwealth, that the crown is quite often served as a way of people being able to, in fact, challenge governments, including the British government. I mean, during the Thatcher years in the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher was unwilling to condemn the South African government over its apartheid policy, there was some talk of Britain getting kicked out of the Commonwealth. And there were actually people in conservative circles in Britain who were angry that the Queen's loyalty seemed to be the Commonwealth as opposed to Britain, per se. So I think as an institution, it has, obviously there wouldn't be a Commonwealth had there not been a British Empire or a British colonial past. But in this day and age, it's not the role of the Commonwealth, nor does the Commonwealth see itself as perpetuating colonialism in any way.
Professor Robson, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for this historical context.
Thank you.
Dr. Marielle Grant Robinson is an associate professor of history at the University of Victoria. Our fourth guest is Bulma Brown, Executive Director of the Coast Research and Advocacy Network, a member of the Victoria Harbourside Rotary Club, and founder of the Support Network for Indigenous Women and Women of Colour. In 2020, she was awarded with the BC Multiculturalism and Anti-Racism Award. Please welcome Bulma Brown.
Thank you so much for having me, Gregor. I mentioned earlier that I am a huge fan of your work at the CBC. I'm also a huge fan of the Belfry Theatre, so thank you, Maddie, and everybody here for inviting me. Looking forward to our conversation.
Great to have you with us. Can you share with us a bit of your own personal and professional background as a nonprofit leader in EDI, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion? You're an advocate for that.
Yeah, I guess I don't really consider myself an advocate because I don't really think of myself in the third person, but I can share a little bit about my work. In my life, I was born in Nigeria. We've been talking about colonization. We were also colonized by the British, became an independent country in 1960. And I was born in northern Nigeria in a predominantly Muslim community, although my family is Christian. And we've been talking about Queen Elizabeth and things like that. And growing up in Nigeria, we didn't really talk about the Queen at all. Unlike Canada, where we see the Queen's image, and some people sing God Save the Queen and all that. I actually never heard the song God Save the Queen until I came to Canada. Shockingly enough, I was like, why are we singing that? It's kind of bizarre. So yeah, it didn't really come up at all. Actually, didn't really know a lot about colonization, shockingly, because growing up in Nigeria, all we're told is, so we got our independence in 1960, we shook hands, and the British left. And I thought that was a bit bizarre. We don't really get taught about, the sort of brutalities of colonization at all. So I had to sort of go on that learning journey on my own, which was very interesting. I left Nigeria when I was 14. My family moved to Botswana because if you know anything about northern Nigeria, there's a lot of religious conflict between Christians getting a bit unsafe and too dramatic, and so my family applied to come to Canada, but back then it took a very long time to get Canadian permanent residency. It took my family about 7 years. And so while they were waiting, we moved to Botswana. My family was working there, went to high school there, and then moved to the United States. I lived in North Dakota for university for a year and a half, and then in 2011, finally, our immigration and all that was approved, and then we moved to Canada, to Victoria. And my family chose Victoria really randomly. I always wonder why they chose this place, although I really love it, but they chose it because of the weather. They were looking through a list of cities and they were like, looks warm, we'll be here. And I was like, if I was to move to another continent far, far away, I feel like I would have done a bit more research about that, but they came here for the weather. And I like it. I really love living here. And in 2014, I started the Support Network for Indigenous Women and Women of Color. We're a healthcare organization focusing on basically improving health outcomes for Black, Indigenous women and women of color. And I started it because, first of all, I didn't know I was Black until I came to Canada. You'd think I would realize that living in the States, but I didn't. I came to Canada, and for the first time, I was like, maybe there's something different about me. And part of that realization was looking at health outcomes and looking at the sort of access to healthcare that even I had difficulties with, although I was a university student and all that. And I also noticed the sort of similarities between health outcomes for people who look like me, Black women, and also Indigenous communities. Unfortunately, there's lots we can talk about in terms of that. And so, yeah, the support network started in 2014, and right now we're providing services across Canada. In the past 6 years, we've been doing quite well in terms of reaching communities across Canada, reaching women across Canada who don't have access to healthcare. And it's everything from providing free counseling, so dental care, etc., looking at healthcare basically with a holistic view. So yeah, that's a little bit about my work.
Can you tell us a bit, there's a lot I want to ask you about, but can you tell us a bit about that allyship, if that's a fair word, between Indigenous communities and Black communities? What have you learned about that, and what's been the value of that relationship?
It's a really great question, and it's something I think about quite a bit. As a person who was colonized, who came to the realization that I was colonized later in life, and looking at my history as a Nigerian person, and looking at the impact of colonization was a tough pill to swallow in many ways, but it made a lot of sense. It's like, okay, this is why this happened. We eat a lot of British foods. My partner is Australian, and they have a huge British influence. And it seems like we grew up in the same place, and it's really bizarre. I'm like, I grew up in Nigeria, he grew up in Australia, but the thing we have in common is the fact that the British influence is so strong. And it's a bit strange, to be honest, the fact that a lot of Nigerian Indigenous communities here are very disconnected from parts of our culture because of colonization, in Canada because of residential schools and colonization and many other factors. And I think, not to get political about Nigerian politics, because that's a whole nother conversation, but I think looking at the impact of colonization on the political system in Nigeria, looking at the impact of colonization, although the British left, they didn't really. A lot of the customs, traditions, were things that continue today, thanks to British influence. And I think in Canada, looking specifically at healthcare, we see that there's a lot of similarities in terms of the fact that Black communities, Indigenous women, for instance, have more barriers to access in healthcare. There's challenges with racism in healthcare for both communities in terms of sexualized violence and things like that. There's similarities there. Breast cancer, similarities there. And then also the big one for me was just lack of access to support and lack of access to information. And for the Black communities in Canada, you can think about that in terms of the legacies of slavery, or you can look at it in terms of immigrants having just more barriers to access and resources. And for Indigenous communities, obviously the legacies of colonization continue till today. So I think allyship, a lot of times that sort of just happened because of those similar struggles. But I think even looking back to the days of slavery, where a lot of Black communities found refuge with Indigenous communities, I think that allyship continues till today in many ways.
What about unconscious bias? It's a term that is still relatively new to a lot of Canadians. Can you talk a bit about it and how it might influence that?
Sure. I think in terms of unconscious bias, it's something that we all have, regardless of if we think about it or not. Growing up, we all have things and ideas that maybe were passed on to us or society has influenced us that suggest to us that some communities or some people are inferior than others. And I think unconscious bias really reflects how we see the world in many ways. So it's decisions, it's thoughts, it's ideas that may unfavorably affect your decisions or actions against one group or the other, in favor of or against. There's a really cool educator in the US, her name is Brenda J. Allen, and she talks about it using this phrase called thinking under the influence. And she says that we make decisions under the influence, whether we know it or not, that are basically based on our implicit bias. And two examples I can think of are things like resumes. So if you think of the fact that people who have ethnic sounding names or names that are different are less likely to access employment, for instance. Or if we think of the fact that people automatically think of Black people as being stronger and not feeling pain in healthcare, which means that Black women, for instance, are less likely to get pain medication, are less likely to be taken serious in healthcare settings. That's unconscious bias. And it's unconscious because when a person is making these decisions, they're not thinking about it like, okay, this person is Black, so I'm gonna do this. They're often things that we just grew up with and don't necessarily investigate, but unfortunately has very serious consequences.
So I thought that was a great description. And I don't want to put all the weight of you on prescribing a cure, but have you come across any ways that are effective at kind of battling unconscious bias and helping people who maybe have good intentions to try to get beyond those biases that are deeply ingrained in them?
I think one of the ways that I think about it, because I also have my unconscious biases, implicit biases that, I think about quite a bit. I think one of the ways of combating it is being thoughtful of the decisions we're making in our everyday lives. As a person who's the executive director of a nonprofit, I think about that just also in terms of hiring, because even under the umbrella of racialized women, there's a lot of diversity under that umbrella. We're not a monolithic group. I think hiring is one of the ways I think about quite a bit. I think Black women, Indigenous women, women of color who have accents should not really be discriminated against, and it's something that people don't really think about when they're looking through resumes really quickly. Another way I think we can think about it is in the nonprofit world, for instance, or you can think about it in the corporate world. I noticed that, people feel more comfortable having racialized people in entry-level positions. I look through nonprofit websites quite a bit, and I'm like, how come the people of color are like the project assistants? And when you look at the CEOs and executive management, they all look white. Like, what's up with that, So I think one of the ways that we can really think of our implicit biases is actually thinking about it and thinking of the decisions we're making. I think also thinking of the media we're consuming. We're talking about, obviously, this play that's Black-led and has lots of Black voices, and it's really rare. One of the reasons I love the Belfry Theater and one of the reasons I really love the work that you guys do is the fact that I get to see shows that challenge me to think different. And I think we can't really challenge our implicit biases without thinking of the media we're consuming, thinking of the decisions we're making, and thinking of whose stories we get to listen to often.
I appreciate what you say about the Belfry trying to have different perspectives. What are some of the key considerations you think should be remembered when working with stories where representation and inclusion is key?
I think the most important thing for me is who is telling the story. Stories have to be authentic, and for me, I prefer to listen to stories told by the communities that are being represented. So I love consuming content by Black creators, and there's a ton of that on the internet, there's a ton of that on mainstream media as well. Also thinking of if the story is culturally sensitive or relevant. Obviously with TV, there's a lot of content out there, but I think when a show is created by the community that's represented, it's more likely that it's gonna get the story right. One of my favorite TV shows is called Insecure, and it is a story of basically Black people in California just living their life. I think that's often kind of strange, because Black shows are often about slavery, or often about violence, or something really bizarre. And to just have a story of Black people living and girlfriends getting together is a bit strange, and it shouldn't be in 2021, So I think representation of authentic voices, making sure that the story is told by creators that represent that community, are probably two of the things that I look out for.
What do you think, and this may be too big of a question to answer effectively in the time we have, but what do you think about when writers, let's say a playwright of one culture wants to include characters of another culture? That can be fraught, because I take your point. It should be the community or members of the community telling their own story. But what if in an increasingly multicultural country like Canada, there's many of us around from different cultures? Any thoughts on how artists, writers, and others can try to responsibly incorporate different voices in a story they might be telling?
Mm-hmm. I think it's something we all do. Like you talk about, Canada obviously has people from different cultures and ethnicities. In the work that I do, obviously I'm not Indigenous, but we offer quite a bit of Indigenous programming, and we really make sure that it's led by Indigenous people. I think in terms of maybe TV or media, there's multiple people that are part of a story. But unfortunately, oftentimes, it's just not representative. So I think even if maybe the director is not Black, if it's a Black show or Black narrative, I think having other people be part of that production is really important. Yeah, that's what I would recommend. And it's not just for media, it could be for, I don't know, nonprofit, it could be for healthcare, it could be in lots of different ways. I think representation could look very different depending on the sort of setting.
And Black talent is underrepresented in film and TV and theater, not only actors, but behind the scenes. In the US, according to the latest statistics, writers, directors, and producers are less than 6% Black, which is less than half of their proportion of the overall population. Mm-hmm. What are the ways that the producing community, theater and so on, but also just audiences can have an influence on that, do you think?
I think we need to watch things that tell diverse stories. I say that as a person who's rewatching Seinfeld and watching Tiger King. It's not the most diverse, but they're funny. I think what we watch really matters because it sends a message to producers and executives that this is interesting and that there's a response to those stories. I think in the age of Netflix, I found out that Tiger King 2 was out because I turned on Netflix and that was the first thing on my screen. And I think we kind of have to go beyond that, especially with algorithms. The algorithm knows what you watch, so it's going to keep recommending things in that same genre, in that same category. I think Netflix and a few other platforms have shows that are under the umbrella of diversity. Watch one, you may not like it, watch another one, and before you know it, like Netflix and the algorithm knows that this is interesting to you and it continues to recommend plays in that category. Looking at the internet, there's always, recommendations in terms of like shows from Black creators or shows from Indigenous creators or just diverse shows that may not be part of your current viewing schedule but could be. I think those are the two most important ways to do that. I think in the past 4 years, we've seen a lot more of things like that, everything from Black Panther to Creed, which is basically Rocky told by a Black man. It's everything from Shang-Chi, it's everything from, there's a lot of plays out there right now that are showing the diversity from a Hollywood perspective, and I think they're really well done. And although those are mainstream examples of diversity in media, there's a lot more in terms of even independent plays and independent shows like what we're talking about right now. So I would say that is probably how I would do it, just looking beyond the surface in terms of what we consume.
I like that. So we can vote essentially with our clicks
Basically.
or at the box office or what have you.
Yeah, like what we're paying for in terms of what we show up for. I think we talk about the Belfry, but even I find that places like Cine Center at UVic have quite a few diverse shows. There's a show going on right now that talks about harm reduction from an Indigenous lens that's happening at Cine Center this week. And so although, yes, you may not find the most diverse shows at the box office, there's so many theaters in Victoria that do offer that perspective.
I wonder finally if you have any thoughts for members of the community, and in a place like Victoria, so many of us are of the majority community who can do more to contribute to social justice and equity and what you've been talking to us about it beyond. And I don't want to put this on you. It's not your responsibility, again, to prescribe it for us, but any thoughts would be appreciated.
Sure. I think for sure we need to understand what racism looks like. I think people often think of racism as being very overt and, where there's slurs and it's dramatic. I think a study came out recently that says that most Canadians consider the US more racist, and I think it's because people think of American racism as just being more dramatic. I think that one of the easier things that we can do is definitely examining our actions. Racism, I find, is often very subtle. It's the little microaggressions, the little look you get at the grocery store, that person walking behind you that's checking out what you're doing to make sure you're not stealing anything. Those are the little actions I think that happens. I think I would definitely recommend that we are a bit more aware of the subtleties of racism. And for me, I think about that a lot in terms of the work I do as a nonprofit executive director, in terms of making sure that the nonprofit world is more diverse. I think we shouldn't notice a trend in 2021 where you see very few nonprofit executive directors, you see very few Black people in nonprofit leadership. I don't think that should be happening because there's lots of very talented, educated Black people. And so for me, that suggests that there's an implicit bias there where people think that Black people are good enough in entry-level positions, but not good enough for higher-level positions. So that's definitely one recommendation. I also think examining microaggressions and what that looks like is really, really important. I think that oftentimes it's, like I mentioned, it's a little look, it's a little stare here and there. And I think being a bystander and intervening when things go wrong is really important, because over the past year, we've heard very, very traumatic stories from members of the community who are Black, who are Asian, who are Indigenous, who have had violence encounters in public and nobody does anything. And I think that should not be happening in 2021.
Bulma, it's great to meet you and have you with us here at B4Play.
Thank
you so much for this.
Thank
Bulma Brown is Executive Director of the Coast Research and Advocacy Network and founder of the Support Network for Indigenous Women and Women of Color. And that concludes this edition of B4Play. Again, it's so nice to see you all in person. And I think the old maxim is correct. The box office is open on the way out. I know most of you got your tickets anyway, but yes, the box office is open. Thanks for coming, everyone.